everyone, for a while now we've been talking about the Spectre and his appearances during the Bronze Age. Now we'll be going over my thoughts on those appearances, my review of those comics, and where we'll be going from here for the character. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the end of this video where we go over why the Bronze Age might be the most important era in Spectre history. For those who have been following my videos on the Spectre, and I'll put a link up for that stuff in all the usual places, you'll know this character has a really interesting history. The Spectre was created during the Golden Age of comics by the co-creator of Superman, with the explicit design of making a superhero even more powerful than the already then popular Man of Steel. It was an interesting creative challenge, as the stronger the hero, the harder it was to create a story with real stakes in it, where that hero was properly challenged. Jerry Siegel and his fellow creators, in the Spectre's first appearance, actually understood how they'd make a character so powerful but also be compelling, and they did that by making him terrifying and unpredictable. With a sense of justice beyond human understanding and powers where he can destroy criminals in the most horrible ways a writer can imagine, the Spectre's very first comic reads very much like a blueprint for the character to follow in the years to come. Unfortunately, the Golden Age of comics was, beyond that, largely incapable of handling such a character and content, based on how they wrote and approached superhero stories at the time. Following the Spectre's initial appearance, the bite gets taken out of the character immediately in his 1940s comics, as the Comics Code Authority set into the industry, normalizing a certain standard of content. The character of the Spectre, as he was originally designed, became impossible. He disappeared from the world of comics for well over a decade until the Silver Age, but unfortunately the Spectre ran into the exact same problems there too. Once again, the majority of appearances of the Spectre in the Silver Age, just like in the Golden Age, come across as pretty lackluster, though there are a couple of exceptions. The Spectre started appearing in various crises that cropped up around this time as conflicts emerged from the newly revealed multiverse, setting the stage very nicely for the Spectre being one of the few forces on Earth that could stand up to beings that exist on a scale beyond our own reality. Meanwhile, Neal Adams, a major name in DC comic book history, also managed to create a handful of stories that once again depicted the Spectre as a scary, unpredictable force of nature, bringing the character back to his first appearance and original potential. Sadly, these little glimmers of a more interesting character weren't enough to save the Spectre, and once again he just sort of disappeared, but for a shorter period of time. This brings us to the Bronze Age, where the Spectre returned and would go on to appear throughout the rest of the Bronze Age, right up until the very end of the 1980s. With darker storytelling firmly established within DC as a possibility by this point, the Spectre suddenly felt at home for the first time ever in the character's history. So suddenly the Spectre was everywhere. There's a mini-series featuring him called The Wrath of Spectre, crossover issues, flashback stories by Roy Thomas featuring the Spectre during his time in the JSA back in the 1940s, The Crisis of Infinite Earths, and even a solo series for the Spectre written by Doug Moench that ran for about 30 issues. The Spectre appeared in more content in the Bronze Age than any of his other appearances in the Silver and Golden Ages combined, having finally found this success as a character. Not only did the character start showing up everywhere, but after almost 5 full decades in existence, the Spectre was finally starting to live up to his potential as originally suggested and designed by Jerry Siegel and the gang. This starts right away with the Spectre's return in the miniseries Wrath of the Spectre by Michael Fleischer and Jim Aparo. The series is interesting to me as it follows up some of the darker concepts Neal Adams had been experimenting with in the Silver Age. After most of the Spectre's appearances up to this point in 1974 were these watered-down vanilla messes I described, these striking comics where the Spectre would violently dispatch petty criminals felt like a lot of fun. The Spectre feels unhinged and far beyond Corrigan's control by this point. The miniseries, however, is clearly ahead of its time. Its changes to the character were not well received by readers in the 1970s. The whole run of books were apparently the result of editor Joe Orlando being mugged, a neat reflection of the reality for people like him living in New York City in the 1970s, that I feel is well documented in The Wrath of the Spectre. You can feel the man's pain, fear, and frustration coming out through the Spectre's raw, unhinged rage. There's this emotional honesty to Wrath of the Spectre that kind of makes it worth reading, coupled with the fact that it was important in establishing the character not only as he was originally designed by Siegel and Company, but also closer to the Spectre we know today. The powerful figure's first steps began here and would continue on throughout the Bronze Age. From here, the character, as I said, started just showing up everywhere. Not just in little crossover appearances and stories, but also repeatedly in Roy Thomas's comics, a flashback series that shows us a bunch of stuff that happened back in the JSA's days around World War II. Roy Thomas is a very talented writer, and with the comics increasingly taking advantage of the relaxed rules around the Comics Code Authority by this point, these stories to me represent the better tales featuring the Spectre during his early time with the JSA. Across a number of guest appearances in comics in the Bronze Age, two are key to the Spectre's history, and absolutely worth talking about. The first is Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, which features the Spectre as a powerful force of heaven being used in a war against the living embodiment of darkness itself. The second is The Crisis of Infinite Earths, a major story in DC from the 1980s that completely rewrote all of reality and featured the Spectre challenging a powerful villain called the Anti-Monitor during a key moment in that particular tale. These two stories are essential in securing something that had been long established about the Spectre, but rarely seen to its full extent. That this being is one of the most powerful superheroes that's ever been seen in DC's comics. Both this run of Swamp Thing and The Crisis are well-regarded, famous comics, so they're easy to recommend and view as essential to the history of the Spectre. Without moments like the Spectre going up against the darkness itself, or arm wrestling the Anti-Monitor over the birth of reality, I seriously doubt the character would have ever earned the reputation he did among fans. Nor would fan interest have developed around this time, allowing for a solo series. Steve Gerber was supposed to actually write the original solo series planned for the Spectre in 1986, but apparently he missed a deadline to watch it because he wanted to go watch the last day of filming for Howard the Duck. In hindsight, this sounds incredibly silly and a profound mistake on Gerber's part, as the 80s Howard the Duck movie is infamously bad. But it does make a lot of sense to me. At the time, comic book movies were rare and few and far between, with only a couple of successful Superman movies out and nothing else to back it up. The idea of George Lucas going from making Star Wars to making a comic book movie, and not even one featuring a famous character like Superman, but instead Howard the Duck, must have been pretty exciting. Because if Howard could get his own movie, and if that movie would have been successful, it would have meant pretty much any character or idea from the comics would have stood a reasonable chance to get their own movie. Instead, Howard the Duck is a terrible movie. It set the industry back a full decade in terms of adapting comic books, and DC was annoyed enough with Gerber missing the deadline that they cancelled Spectre's planned solo series entirely. It's unfortunate how some things work out, but for the Spectre, it may have been for the best. A year later, Doug Moench and a number of other artists began their own solo series for the Spectre. Though Moench's run of Spectre comics are far from perfect, a lot of fun characters are introduced, there's some interesting exploration of more surreal cosmic forces, with the Spectre being a solid choice to navigate such content, and Moench was able to navigate some of the Spectre's more disturbing elements while also making him more human than he's ever been. I don't love that once again someone felt the need to depower the Spectre for the purposes of him getting a solo series, as it feels it defeats the purpose of the character. It holds back the fun of the Spectre in this era quite a bit, but this solo series does have its moments. There are fun villains, ties to other characters and DC events, and I even like the use of Madame Xanadu, as it gives the Spectre more connective tissue with the rest of the DC universe. The series is fun, but I'm not sure if it's totally worth your time on its own. If you're looking for a better solo series, the one in the 1990s is far better regarded, and we'll be getting into that next in our coverage of the Spectre's history. That being said, it is worth recognizing how important Moench is in getting us to that point. Without him firming up some of the darker elements of the Spectre's character, his relationship with Jim Corrigan, and how he interacts with the other cosmic forces in the DC universe, we wouldn't have the Spectre as we know him. This is furthered by Moench's deft ability to navigate the confusing continuity around the Spectre during the Crisis of Infinite Earths, as there's a lot of stuff that kind of jumps around. He turns it into a coherent, clear, and consistent narrative, which is very welcome. However, the series does swerve inconsistently from the more traditional superhero storytelling at the time to the more surreal, wild, and dangerous horrors of the Spectre. As time goes on, it seems clear DC was struggling to find an audience for the series, likely because of this inconsistent tone. And so they started looking for different ideas to get this whole thing going. And so Moench began really stretching for different ideas of stories and stuff that might sell. That leads us to Cryptica Crimes. I don't hate these characters that are introduced as new employees for Jim Corrigan, but they aren't all that memorable in the series either, and the first real sign of trouble for this volume of the Spectre. That, and over time, the various artists involved with the series seem to lose their touch. The final issues of Spectre Volume 3 seem to have printing error after error in their art. I don't know what the circumstances were behind producing these comics, so I don't want to be too hard on any individual artist or editor, but whatever the case, the final product comes across as being rushed, and it gets very distracting. This is most clear in the coloring, as it seems there are real struggles to get the character's hair color right from panel to panel. This is pretty amateur stuff for comic books, so it's disappointing to see, and maybe not so surprising to hear that the cancellation happened not long after. So with all this in mind, we're going to move on to the 1990s with what is commonly regarded as the best Spectre volume ever. But until that time, I'm going to take a little break from the Spectre, so make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you can see those future videos when they come out. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.